If you're a student in a design program right now and you want to know how to start moving in the direction of the career you want, this video is for you. What's up? This is MVA Joshua. In this video, it captures an off-the-cuff lecture I gave to my typography students last year when we could still meet in buildings and be within breathing distance of each other. The first chunk of this is specifically directed towards people who already have a career, have already gone to school, and now we're going back and want to switch things up. But after that, it's all about the mindset and the things to start doing while you're still in school in order to start building the career that you want. As always, these are ultra hard-earned lessons because I do everything the hard way. So take that in mind. The other thing that I will apologize in advance for is this lecture wasn't really meant to happen. We were recording what was happening on a projected image on the wall. So the entire video is basically looks like this, a hand occasionally popping into screen. My apologies, I hope you dig it anyway. If you have any follow-up questions, leave a comment, and I hope this finds you well. Thanks a lot for watching. Who is planning to quit their job once you're done? Have you started thinking about what you are going to be doing or what it is that you want to do? If you don't start prepping for jumping ship from whatever you're doing, even in as much as making sure that the way that you're thinking about it is not like, oh, I wish I could quit my job, but I'm doing these things in order to make it that I can quit my job, that once the program ends, then there becomes like a reason not to quit your job. Then this, if you're paying student loans, if those kick in, then there's another reason not to quit your job. More and more fully reasonable reasons pop up not to quit. A trend that I had noticed for a long time was that like the more you had a real job, the harder it was to segue into a new career. Because if you have it basically like a shitty borderline menial job, if you quit it to go do something like a 3-month contract that doesn't work out, you know that you can go and figure out a way to get that money back much more reasonably than if you're fully dependent on like, I don't know, $42,000 a year, whatever the number is. That's like, oh shit, I got to get like an actual job. So getting prepared for, it's almost certainly going to hurt when it's time to make the change. And if you're not prepared for that, then you won't make the change, because reasonable people don't want to take pay cuts, don't want to jump into chaos and whatnot. But the market, just like the general kind of like agency market, is most things start out as contracts. So if you're not willing to deal with like a scary situation, all of a sudden not quitting your job seems like a good idea. And so the reason you got into this program 2 years ago might have been like, yeah, I can't wait, I'm gonna blah, 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 I'm gonna move it around, I'm gonna be a designer, great. All of a sudden, 2 years later, it's like, you know, I could probably do this and then freelance at night, which is a totally reasonable position to take, other than it being like a massive compromise and a kind of like soul eroding thing. So one thing I would say is that if the plan is to quit, besides this program, make sure that you're doing things that move in that direction. Like at the very least, a website that you're not saying things like, oh, it's almost done. You know, like a website that is maybe not perfect, but you're ready to show it to people. That if you Google your own name, that there are 1, results at all, and 2, that those results are moderately robust. If you Google your name, a LinkedIn profile is probably going to show up near the top, in which case, if that's all there is, someone is going to click on it. Make sure that there's stuff there. Not like saying you need to start writing articles on LinkedIn, but like make sure there's a photo and like an up-to-date job background, stuff like that. Just make sure that you're doing those things. And then of course, informational interviews and stuff like that. All of those things that are going to make it easier to pull the cord when the time comes, because we're all adults with like adult problems and life situations to varying degrees. And the less prepared you are for that, the more that we do the like kind of cowardly adult thing, which is convince ourselves that more of the bullshit is the responsible way to go. You know, like, well, I have insurance, and you know, lots of people don't have insurance. That's the kind of like weird ways that you'll gaslight yourself. Whatever, it costs a lot of money to be alive, basically. You know, it costs like a certain amount of dollars an hour to be alive. So you obviously need the money you currently have, but you have to be able to come to grips with 9 times out of 10, when you make that shift, there's gonna be either a pay cut or a stability cut. You know, if you have like 2 jobs that add up to a full-time job, you going into freelance is gonna be a pay increase, but your stability is gonna go away. But if you have like a career, even a fairly entry-level career, and you move to freelancing, as someone just starting out, you're probably gonna end up taking a pay cut plus the stability, or just coming in as like a junior designer, which might be like really irritating as like a 32-year-old. But you know, that's what you gotta do to get in. But then it's like you have to just know, I gotta be willing to go through some discomfort and just really coming to grips with that. You cannot quit for a year, but you can start planning it now. And then who knows, maybe earlier than a year, you realize from thinking about this, like if you start thinking about this a lot, you'll start doing different things, right? Like, you know how if you start collecting something, you gotta have every piece of it. And then if you start selling stuff, you start wanting to sell everything. Like, has anyone ever done that thing where you wanna purge stuff? And at first you get rid of 2 books. And then you're like, well, I got rid of 2, I could get rid of 3. Then you grab a couple more, and then all of a sudden you're like, I wonder how little stuff I need. And you just start dumping shit. The opposite is like when you start collecting stuff, you start collecting it. But you know, like once your mind is in a certain focus, then you start behaving in a way that kind of matches where your head is at. If your head right now is like, yeah, it'd be really nice to quit my job, then your actions are gonna be like blasé. I think it's really important because being in this room, the idea is to change your life. But when it comes time, it's one thing to give up some evenings and weekends and learn something. It's another thing to give up a salary for a while or whatever that, or to be like, oh fuck, I'm gonna have to move to do the kind of work I want to do. Like when I went to school here, everything was geared around this idea that we would go work at the Walker. And then it turns out, one, best case scenario, 2 people are working at the Walker, and chances are they were grad students from Cranbrook, not MCAD undergrads. And then you'd go to ad agency and they'd look at your portfolio. It was just such a mismatch. It was really hard to go from being like portfolio worthy at MCAD or scholarship worthy. Like, here's $10,000 and like blah, 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 blah. And you're like, oh, fuck, this is awesome. And then you go to like whatever, a place like Martin, whatever it's called, Martin Wood or something, Martin Williams. And they're just like fucking blank stare as you're like explaining, one, all these goddamn books, and then not speaking their language in any way, shape, or form, and then no one having a conversation about, you know that to do the work you want to do, you need to move to New York. Like, you don't get to stay in Minneapolis and do like arts work unless you do it for free at night. To the same extent that nobody in New York does agricultural work. Like, if you want to do agricultural work, you come to the Midwest. You know, if you want to do entertainment work, it's a good idea to go to LA. It's not impossible to do these things in these different markets, but it's a very rude awakening to think that you are prepared to do one thing, but you hadn't really been like, oh shit, I gotta move. Because like, I didn't want to move to New York. I like to visit New York. I don't particularly like New York. And then you've kind of realized like, fuck, I'm not prepared at all for the market here. For me, like, I did an unpaid internship, fresh out of school, paying student loans. I had like a bizarro production job that I worked part-time, and then I had an unpaid internship because like my portfolio was just so out of sync with the market, and the way I understood how to talk about design was just, it wasn't that it was wrong, it's just completely wrong for where the work was here. So getting clear on that kind of stuff is really smart, because it's like, not only do maybe you have to quit your job in a year, but maybe you really have to be like, If I'm not gonna move, I need a lot of connections in, let's say, Los Angeles. So then you know, all right, I have to save up money and I need to go to Los Angeles like 2 or 3 times over the next year. And that's where my informational interviews need to be. They do not need to be at Fallon, Duffy, Martin Williams, Martin Wood, Martin Venezky Wood or whatever. It needs to be at the places that do shit for Game of Thrones. And then again, clarifying that and then being like, okay, I'm gonna start coming up with a plan. You're not gonna be able to necessarily make dramatic movement on it, but you'll adjust shit, you know what I mean? Like, you'll maybe not buy something that you want because you're like, I need this money for a plane ticket. Yeah, that's the thing to think about. Hopefully that is not depressing or weird and just instead very realistic. Cause like, I'm not by any means saying no one, I'm 100% on board with it is fucking bad for your soul not to do the thing that you plan to do, but it's demoralizing to realize that you've been going like planning on doing one thing. You didn't have a firm grasp on reality to kind of problem solve against. So then you end up kind of taking these weird steps back. So yeah, if you haven't started that plan, I would really just start thinking about it and start talking to people about it and figuring out what places you actually want to work, because maybe you're not going to work at that place, but gearing yourself towards, say, a knock is going to help you get in at places that are similar to knock. I think a good example is like if you wanted to do photo art direction, like they do a fucking ton of that kind of stuff. Not every agency does that, and not every agency does it in a way that you might be interested in. Like food photography and shooting catalogs and signage for Target in Miami, like 2 totally different animals, you know what I mean? And it's one of those things of like, again, you can just kind of problem solve against that thing that you actually want. And then you can figure out like, okay, there's Knock that does this. There's also these 2 other places. And then there's these places in Austin or Portland or New York or wherever it might be. So one of the things to think about is that like, if it feels good, like if something about it feels right, embrace that. There's a good chance that what that's telling you is you're wired to work in a certain way. Like I always really liked classes where they forced us to we'd start at 1 and then have to have work for critique at 4:30 or 5. And you just had to make something on the spot. Those were always my favorite things, and I didn't put it together for a really long time.